Just to pick up that point, before the break, Daniel, we're talking about effective programs, and it's a long process.
Absolutely.
What I'd like to know is, how do you measure the effectiveness of those programs? Do you go with it step by step, or do you go at the end of the day and say, how do you say it has been successful?
I think there are two elements to it. There's the element where you measure it as you go along, and you can do that with dipstick polling, pulse polling, what they call 60-second polls, where there's something on an intranet, or you're able to engage with employees on an ad hoc basis to establish how effective it is along the way. But there are three levels of measurement. There's measuring process, content, and impact. Measuring the process and the content is measuring the effectiveness of how the newsletter looks, how engaged people are to it, whether people are reading it and aware of a particular message. Measuring impact is measuring at a number of levels, and it's measuring whether people understand the message as opposed to simply being aware of it. More importantly, do people live the brand, live the message? And that can largely be done through quantitative and qualitative research. So you would do it through surveys, but you would also do focus groups, management interviews, employee interviews to assess the level of engagement that they have within the organization.
Right.
But you would also measure it on customer satisfaction. And this is an element that I think a lot of internal comms managers in South Africa are struggling to come to terms with. That one of the pillars of measurement is your external stakeholders. Because as we said at the beginning of the discussion, it's actually how the touch point is engaging with people externally, or even with other service departments internally. So in terms of that impact measurement, you need to analyze that. But you also need to complete a working progress with human capital management in order to understand retention, looking at exit interviews to see if people are engaged to the brand while they're there, and what the reasons are for leaving. So there are a number of ways of doing it, but without that impact level of understanding the real reasons and real tangible deliverables to it behind the scenes, then all you're doing is measuring how pretty a newsletter is and if people read the content.
Grant, any measurement systems in place when I mean, obviously it's also a process.
Yes,
when you're talking about leadership and you're doing your coaching, but measurement systems in place to say, okay, we're on the right track?
Yes, we have to do that. I think it's so important. And the measurement needs to be done before, middle, and afterwards.
Right.
So what you're doing in our case is we are measuring the perceptions internally and externally. Internally with the staff, externally with the customers, and seeing, what are they thinking, what are they feeling? Because what you're doing with all of this, with branding, is all about managing feelings.
Yeah.
So what do they feel? We then launch the program, see afterwards how it's going, or in between how it's going, and then afterwards to see the success of it. It is very important because it makes the whole process accountable.
Right. And I like what you just said there about it's about feeling. Because brand, at the end of the day, is a promise. And it's about feeling, and it's about values. And it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because on the one hand, it could be a benefit when your staff or your employees are putting out a positive message about your brand, but it could be a negative if it's negative messages going out there. Daniel.
It can definitely be, but that's where Grant was talking earlier about the leadership, and the leadership of the people who need to have trust in an organization, trust enough in the organization that people will seek advice from them, seek the information from them, and when they receive information that's negative in the business, they have the trust to go to a line manager and say, can you tell me the whole story?
That can make or break a brand, isn't it?
It can. And if you look at global research that's been done, there's fascinating research coming out of the UK at the moment from Professor Veronica Hopaley at Cass University, London. And they were trying to understand levels of trust in organizations. And what they determined is that 80% of an organization's employees will trust a line manager, but on the same token, 20% are the only small contingent that trust senior leaders. So what you're saying is 80% of your business actually don't trust the most senior people in the business. And they took it one step further, and they asked management if they understood what's happening in the lower levels of the organization. 80% of managers said yes. When staff were asked if the leaders understand the direction of the business, what's happening at the business, where the rubber hits the road, 80% said no. Now that creates a huge disconnect, and that break of trust, or that breach of trust, where the rubber hits the road in an organization is critical. And it goes back to what Grant was saying earlier on about creating powerful leaders with very strong personal brands that are seen not just as managers in a business, but a leader. And Grant, I'm sure you'll agree that leaders don't have to be managers and managers don't have to be leaders.
Absolutely. That's right. I mean, leadership can be on any level in an organization.
Right.
But you're right, though. Those staff members, they need to be able to be inspired on a daily basis.
Yes.
And inspiration as opposed to motivation. So they are inspired on a daily basis, inspired by what they see in their leader, inspired by what their leader is telling them. Remember, there are two parts to a message. It's what you say and what people hear. Two parts to a message. So you want to make sure that you consistently drive in the right message through.
Do you think that it could be a platform for change, internal branding? Just something that pops to mind is the new Vodacom rebranding. You know, it's not just a logo change. You know, they've changed their management structure. They've done a whole internal campaign.
Yes.
Now when you pick up the phone, I don't know when last you phoned Vodacom, but when you pick up the phone, they say, hello, how may I make you smile? So what other examples can we think of?
Well, how does that make you feel?
Lovely.
Feels great, doesn't it? So it starts right there.
Absolutely.
So it's a generational
because it's your first point of contact, like we said, it's your touch point.
Exactly.
That's correct.
And you can already see, right, it's a change. It's not we've gone from blue to red.
That's right.
Even, you know, the staff morale, you know, customer service has changed.
Yeah. Yeah, the attitude is different.
The attitude is different.
Yeah. And that does start internally within an organization. And I think where Vodacom went right in this particular case, and a lot of organizations go wrong, is that they started the internal change process before they started the external change process. So they took solid advice on board of what customers were frustrated by and what they weren't happy with, and they tried to identify the areas for development. They improved on those internally so that when they took the brand to market, those touch points were already there, and that's fantastic. Now, what's also very interesting is, and going back slightly to what you were touching on, Jacqui, about measurement, it's more than just a double-edged sword, because within an organization, your FD is saying, well, internal communication is a nice to have. How do you actually look at it as a hardcore return? Now, something like this is where you can start measuring a hardcore return, because people will want to stay with the brand, because besides getting a cell phone that I can quite frankly get from any one of other 4 service providers, you're going to ultimately stay with the brand that gives you the better experience. And research hasn't been done in South Africa to this, but overseas good research shows that the market to book ratio of organizations with effective internal communication, specifically organizations that communicate competitive or competitors and what's happening in the competitive environment, the industry, strategy and performance in the organization, and what customers are saying about them, can have a market to book ratio or an intangible asset value of up to 43% higher than organizations with poor internal communication practices.
Wow.
So it goes to show that even the FD can be kept happy when it comes to talking about employee engagement.
Because they want bottom line. Bottom line.
It is.
I just drew the results of 2010 Deloitte Best Company to Work For survey.
Oh, yes.
McDonald's South Africa. And why? For me, if I think McDonald's, it's consistency. You go to McDonald's, you know what to expect,
Absolutely.
you know what you're getting. You know, it's not a burger, is not different from day to day. Like you said, different experiences. That was in the large category. Medium category was Flight Center.
Interesting.
Interesting. And small category was Microsoft.
Well, McDonald's have just done a whole changeover as well. You see that they've changed the outlets.
Significant change.
Yeah, big changes there because they're trying to create the experience and the feeling.
Yeah.
So they've worked hard on that.
And they're going more sort of health conscious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Flight Centre is very interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
It is. I think behind the scenes, though, it's the touch points that you create internally that create the environment conducive to be considered a top employer. And I'll use a practical example again with TFMC because it's a personal example we've worked with. But when it comes to communicating complex information, one of the things that employees often say is we don't know what's going on in the business and nobody tells us what's going on in the business. Yeah. And if you look at generational theory, the Gen X and Y, which account for the majority of the workforce today, they want simple solutions, face-to-face communication, and you want to communicate in plain and simple language. And what we did is we took a very complex situation and we broke it down into a roadmap. So it looks like a London tube, but it shows where each and every single department within the business has milestones to achieve an overall objective. And you're able to create a bigger picture where every single person in the organization understands where they fit into to deliver the sum of the whole. And a very good story about that is when President Kennedy at the time went to Cape Canaveral to the Space Center, and he went up to a sweeper who was working around the engine of the space shuttle, and he went up to this guy and he said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm sending a man to the moon." He didn't say that he was a sweeper. He understood how important his small function was, because if the dirt got into the engine, the space shuttle wouldn't take off. And it really goes to show that an engaged employee is an employee that understands that without him or her performing that small task, putting a screw into a machine that ultimately pays the roads. Part of the value chain. Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's where internal communication comes into play. It's not the role of training, and it's not alone the role of human capital management. It is the role of internal communication, and that puts pressure on communicators these days.
So let's ask the question, what happens if it's neglected and there's poor internal communication or poor internal branding? What happens? What can potentially happen?
I think lots of interesting things can happen. But I tell you, from my experience, I recently had an experience with an organization. When I walked into the organization felt absolutely dead. There was a negative energy. You can pick up on the energy. Energy was just so low. And when I got to speak to some of the staff members, I noticed that they were feeling threatened, feeling insecure. They didn't know where the company was going. There was no established brand promise. And they were losing a lot of customers. So the side effects are huge. If you want a company with productive, happy employees, it starts with your internal communications, internal branding. If you don't have that, you can't expect them to take that experience outside, because there is no experience inside.
If the inside doesn't get it, how's the outside going to get it?
There we go.
But also, just in closing, when I think internal branding, I think fun. I think team building and doing fun things together and uplifting and, like you said, inspiring each other. Shouldn't it just be fun at the end of the day as well?
As well, yes, but it's very important how you say as well, because you have to bring a tangible to life. And I'll give you a quick example. We do work with the National Development Bank of Botswana, which is very interesting. It's a different cultural mix. But what we do there is they were launching a new strategy, which will take them through the next 3 years. And they also had a team building exercise. But as part of that exercise, we drove up and we painted their hands and we got them to stamp their hand on a piece of paper, sign next to it and put a date on it. And we're building a 6x4 meter poster that is going to go in the entrance hall at the head office in Gaborone. And it's going to show staff that, yes, they had fun, but guys, you're committed to delivering a commercial objective for 2014. And that's where, yes, it can be fun, but you've got to have a business output.
Because people are more inclined to buy into things while they're having fun. So you're saying, yes, of course it's serious, but a fun element will get people motivated and inspired.
And when they're part of it.
I think so. I think it's about saying this is the vision, this is where we're going to, but these are our expectations and these are the behaviors that we're going to reward, so that everybody's on the same page. So fun is a huge part of it. It's important that you have fun in the company, but you need to create those deliverables. And you need to be recognized for creating those deliverables along the way.
Right, because the FD is going to want to know that.
That's right.
And one of the measurements of that is your engagement. And what we do with organizations when we assess that is to understand how many staff are engaged, accessible, trapped, and at risk. Now, engaged staff are ones who want to be in the organization and will stay. Accessible are, no, I'm going to stay here, but if I get offered a job, I'm out of here.
Right.
Your at risk are your normal 6% that are going to leave anyway. Your trapped are your dangerous ones, because they're the ones that don't want to be there but will stay and can impact the accessible and engaged employees. Now, when you put a matrix like that together and sit with a human capital manager and you say, let's put numbers to this. What is your actual financial risk and how does risk management play a role in internal communication? Then again, you're starting to talk the business language. So you do the fun around it, but you've still got to have an outcome and an output that will show how it's impacting on the organization.